For that in-depth analysis, it was great, as usual, your research. Now we are very pleased to have Judith Passingham, our chair of the ESOMAR Professional Standards Committee, here to discuss the critical role that standards and ethics play in the future of our industry. Judith's talk, titled Do the Right Thing, will cover how adopting high ethical standards and acting as trusted authorities will help researchers continue to lead with credibility. Judith, come on up to the stage and take it away. Here's the clicker.
Oh, thank you. I can see some people already leaving the room when the word standards is mentioned. So what I'm going to try and do this afternoon is to persuade you, and I think probably I've got all my friends and future colleagues in this room, and I hope there are some others as well, but I'm going to try and persuade you that codes, standards, and guidelines reflecting high ethical behaviour are the secret to a highly successful future for our sector. So codes and guidelines as a kind of secret sauce, if you like. So do the right thing. That's the title of my presentation. So if we do this, this will help researchers to conquer the world. That's what we're trying to do. So I think it's indisputable that the environment in which we live, in which we operate, presents enormous challenge, often in contradictory ways. This is how I feel about the world at the moment. So we live in times where the notion of truth is more elastic than it ever was. And the rise of what may be described as deliberately fake is a kind of global phenomenon. Here are a few. You can see the Pope in a puffer jacket. I think you've all seen that one. Armed gunmen at polling stations. President Macron looking as if he's enjoying joining in some riots there. And for some reason, an enormous shark washed up on a beach in North Carolina. And this one is apparently created with widely available software to get more personal likes on Instagram, so you can do this too. The World Economic Forum Global Risks Perception Study, which is worth a look if you're not familiar with it, 2024, very recent, reports that misinformation and disinformation is the single largest global risk in a list ranked by severity of topic. So this is short-term risk, that's within 2 years. And this report states that truth will come under pressure as polarization grows and technological risks remain unchecked. And it notes that as 3 billion people head to the polls within a 2-year window, this problem it might undermine the legitimacy of newly elected governments as bad actors leverage capabilities to further widen societal and political divides. Let's look at some data sets. Fantastic data sets out there produced by researchers. This is the Gallup Confidence Index, and it's ranking major US institutions consistently between 1979 and 2023. See that rather depressing, lowest ever ranking, 2023, 26%. Now, if citizens don't trust age-old institutions, how can we get them to trust researchers? So I think that's the first question perhaps we should ask ourselves. This one is from the Eurobarometer data, EU 27, so it's a huge sample base, April-May 2024, fieldwork by Varian. And you can see a high level of agreement here linking disinformation with democracy. So people thinking that disinformation is a concern for democracy, 86%. And perhaps at the bottom, a level of over-optimism about being able to identify disinformation yourself at 61%. I think there's a very important question for researchers here. What can we do to isolate research from disinformation? This one is from the Eurobarometer Flash dataset. The fieldwork this time is by Ipsos, and again, it's the EU 27 base. And this looks at most used media to access news in the past days. So 71% claim to access TV for news, 42% online press. So these are legislated, legitimate sources. 37% social media. The white line is the percentage point difference between 2022 and 2023 fieldwork. So social media for news goes up from 26% in 2022 up to 37% in 2023. It's 1 year across the whole of the EU 27. That is an enormous shift. And the question here for researchers is, what can we do here to build trust in a social media environment which is largely unregulated, let's face it. And looking at this, the increase from 37% amongst Gen Pop to a whopping 59% amongst those aged 15 to 25. So what can we do to build trust in a social media environment as researchers amongst younger groups? Particularly when we see those younger groups exhibiting an increased trust in social media. So the contradictory nature of all of this. So this is from the Pew Research Center, highly reputable organization, looking at the US, comparing 2022 with 2016. And you can see there 18 to 29-year-olds on the left exhibiting a reduced trust in established news organizations. This is also true for all adults, by the way, so that's quite concerning. And there's a substantial increase in trust in social media as a news source, basically. This is touching emerging markets, or sort of, maybe that's the wrong phrase, but sort of this is from the 2023 Digital News Report, which is funded by Reuters, with fieldwork by YouGov. Again, a substantial sample, but importantly, it is an online sample. And this is looking at the proportion using TikTok for news, ranked by proportion for those geographies where TikTok is legal. And we see here a prevalence of higher indexing countries in Asia, Latin America, Africa in this ranking. So average across all geographies, 13%. And so we see disinformation risks and concerns on the one hand, and we see an increasing trust in social media for news on the other, and particularly for younger groups. We also see this. The rise and rise and rise of privacy legislation as a topic, mirroring the rise of the digital economy, as we know, the desire of governments to protect their citizens' data, and now AI-related considerations. And at this point, concrete privacy legislation covers 70% of nations and 80% of the global population. And this topic very much concerns us as we operate in a largely global market, and our ability to transfer data across boundaries, talk to legislators effectively on the basis of proven responsible and ethical behaviour, to secure derogations from an unfavourable legislation. And the more legislation there is, obviously, the more risk is of that happening. So we need to keep being active all the time on this, or to secure favoured status, and most importantly of all, to be fair to research participants and to anticipate and follow the law. And so how does this soup of change impact us? What should we do and what should we aim for? And I'd argue there are 4 points for us to consider. 1, consumer trust in the research and insights industry. 2, client or user trust. 3, legislator trust. And 4, our ability to differentiate our industry from other areas: social media, taskification, marketing, advertising, etc., etc. The first point is about consumer trust in research. And I would argue that this is a topic that we have badly neglected as an industry. And here's one example: the way we describe and define populations. So I believe that our industry should be leading efforts to genuinely reflect populations and their dynamic changes. We should be the reference point. In some cases, we're still using classifications developed in the 1950s and 60s. We're often using terminology that's not inclusive, sometimes patronizing and pejorative. Some examples: highest level of education, aka, are you a dunce? Are you age 65 or over? When I get to the age of 65 and I'm then grouped in the same demographic group as my mother, I can assure you all I will not be behaving in any way like her, just as one example. Men first, women second, and if you define in another way, well, maybe there's a classification for you, or maybe there isn't. Are you the head of household? If you asked that in our household, there would be a fist fight. So this is all not very good, and it's question formats and approaches that arguably make research participants feel irrelevant or inadequate, and they're not reflective of the dynamic societies in which we live. So they put research participants off, even if they're not defining in that way, even if they're not 65 plus, even if they're not defining in another way, it puts research participants off. So we set up a project a couple of years ago to tackle these issues. We're making progress, and to hear more of the detail, please go tomorrow to the session at 14:50, led by John Poulston of the Professional Standards Committee, with Trixie Cartwright, Liam McTurnan, Frank Buckler. They will discuss these topics in detail. And if we can join the project, help the project, comment on the consultations, and more importantly, implement our recommendations in your business. If you're a panel company in this audience, please consider implementing our recommendations in your business. And if you're a client, please insist that your agencies implement these findings in your business, so we can start to make our industry better in terms of how we're defining populations and give ourselves credibility by doing so. Loads of discussion on LinkedIn about this topic. Every time I switch on LinkedIn, well, what about all these problems in the way that we're designing questionnaires? So question formats and approaches designed to bore research participants and make them feel undervalued. Here's a list of complaints and problems. You know it well. You've looked at the LinkedIn lists as well. Well, we've got to start to solving many of these problems. It's available on the ESOMAR site. There's a little barcode on the board outside. And I think this is now an implementation issue. I think we know what to do. I think widespread adoption of these ideas and approaches as company policy and practice would help us to get better quality research. It would reduce the amount of what may be classified as fraud, that part created by bored and frustrated research participants, and that would generate a better trust in what we do. On the topic of trust, it's not a revelation that opinion polls usually represent the most public aspect of what we do, covering political polls as well as important large-scale studies that inform decision makers, so like all of the Eurobarometer examples I showed a moment ago. And this area's got a disproportionate influence on our industry, and it touches all of the stakeholders here on the left side of this chart. And in this area, ESOMAR and WAPOR work closely together. So David Jodice, President-elect of WAPOR, and Kathy Frankovic from the ESOMAR Professional Standards Committee are working on these tools and updating these tools. So we've got freedom to publish opinion polls. We're looking at the general polling guidance at the moment in a project. And by actively using these tools, if you're in the polling game, a standard business practice, this will help us to build trust amongst all of these stakeholders, but it will have a lifting up quality, if you like, to what we do in an industry generally. So there's a connectivity between polling and everything else that we do. One of the topics in the industry creating distrust is the topic of sample fraud. And estimations of the size of the problems vary. There's a portion, quite a large portion, we believe, that's created by poor respondent or research participant experience. This is self-inflicted, and it's a legitimate concern. Plus, we've got the impact of AI coming in to this area. So the GDQ, or Global Data Quality Initiative, is an important industry response to this issue. So work thus far has focused on defining a consistent terminology, developing tools the research participants issue discussed, evaluation of technological solutions, and navigation guidance. And if I could highlight one thing from this work so far, and this is from the SampleCon work, showed that a reasonable proportion of survey links are not encrypted. There are enough unprotected links that link manipulation is the top form of fraud in online surveys. So a policy decision by everyone in this room handling sample that all survey links should be encrypted would help to reduce fraud. And that action would help to improve client and user trust in the quality of what we produce. One of the most important tools we have in our armory is the ICC ESOMAR International Code. I don't have any Ray Harryhausen sort of jiggling eyeballs, which was fantastic, thanks Xavier. But I'm just going to explore this a little bit. It touches all of these issues in a substantive way. It's recognised by over 60 associations in more than 50 countries, and it gains significant weight from the adoption of the ICC, who've got over 6 million members in more than 100 countries, and this fits in the umbrella of the advertising and marketing code. And that's very important for us because it gives us symmetry between that code and ours in terms of definition and differentiation, and authority with regulators. So there are a number of specific protections of members of public in the code, and here's a list of those, things like data minimization, differentiation, secondary data, vulnerable individuals. For clients and users of research, it represents an important common currency for professional standards and an ethical approach for multi-country work. And this is very important when you're dealing with an increasingly disintermediated supply chain. So that includes a lot of obligations around transparency, findings and recommendations supported by data and that sort of thing. And then the code provides the basis for solid discussions with legislators. So here there is an emphasis on reasonable enforcement through self-regulation. And this is very important to make sure we're not caught up in adjacent legislation, as I said earlier. So how can we move to the status of conquering the world, which is perhaps a little bit of an ambitious, but sort of I'm a great believer in the idea that action is the thing and that concrete action helps to drive differentiation. And I believe that we need to start with an energetic implementation of what we already have in our hands. Now, there will, of course, be much more that we need to do. A well-funded initiative to market our industry more effectively to citizens within the social media environment could be a strong candidate. Differentiating the quality of our outputs as real and reliable could be another. But it will be hard to do those things if the research experience itself remains a poor one. And so we have to fix some basic things. So this is my wish list. To adopt the material that we have on the demographics, to adopt the guidances that we have, to enforce and embed and enshrine the practices that we have in the ICC ESOMAR code. Before I finish, I'd just like to thank my colleagues on ESOMAR's Professional Standards Committee, and here you can see a list of our committee, if you like, on the left. So you can see there we've got a fantastic group of individuals who give freely of their time and energy to work on all these codes and guidelines. And anyone that's worked on anything like this will know it's extremely time-consuming and very complex. And it's a fantastic group to work with. So I'd like to thank them, and for the ESOMAR staff who are involved in this practice listed there as well. I hope I've persuaded you to take the codes and guidelines out of the cupboard and look at them again for the first time and make them live in your business through effective implementation. If you'd like to discuss this further, if you'd like to come and argue with us or discuss or debate, we will be in the Delta room tomorrow morning. 9:30 to 10 will be Xavier and Julia talking on the GMR, the market sizing report. Vinay from Procter & Gamble, who's a member of the Professional Standards Committee, and myself will be there between 10 and 11 talking about the code and the standards material. And then between 11 and 12, Kathy Frankovic will be there on polling. And there is also the session on demographics tomorrow afternoon, and I'd really ask you to go along to that. So thank you for coming and paying a bit of attention to this session. Very much appreciate that. And I hope it's encouraged you a little bit to do the right thing. Thank you.